The Bride of the Mist, the account of Emily Turner. Chapter 1. The Mystery of Silent Creek. Silent Creek was a town like many others, with its quiet streets and old houses that seemed to whisper secrets from the past. With about 20,000 inhabitants, the town was far from small, but it had that air of a forgotten place, where life moved at a slow, almost dragging pace. The facades of the houses, covered in ivy and moss, gave the place an ancient appearance, and at night, the dense fog that rose from the hills wrapped the town in a shroud of mystery. Emily Turner had grown up in Silent Creek. Her parents moved there when she was still a child, seeking the peace and tranquility that only a small town could offer. For years, Emily felt safe in the town. Everyone knew everyone, and crime was rare, almost non-existent. But that changed when the first women began to disappear. The first case was treated as an isolated incident. A young woman, just over 20 years old, disappeared without a trace. The local police conducted extensive searches but found no clues. Without signs of violence or a body, the case soon fell into oblivion, treated as just another of the many unsolved stories that surrounded the town. But when other women began to disappear under equally mysterious circumstances, the atmosphere in the town changed. Silent Creek, once known for its tranquility, became a place of fear and distrust. The streets that were once safe, even at night, now became deserted as soon as the sun set. And to make matters worse, rumors began to spread. People said that a ghostly figure, a woman dressed as a bride, had been seen wandering the town on foggy nights. The legend of the Spectral Bride took shape, and with it, the town's fear grew. At first, Emily didn't pay much attention to these rumors. Like many others, she believed the disappearances were the work of an ordinary criminal, someone who knew how to hide well and who was taking advantage of the climate of fear to act. But everything changed the night she and her friend Sarah decided to investigate one of the abandoned restrooms on the outskirts of Silent Creek. Sarah was the opposite of Emily. While Emily was cautious and reserved, Sarah was curious and fearless. She had always been interested in local legends, and when she heard about the abandoned restroom where the Spectral Bride supposedly appeared, she convinced Emily to go there with her. "It's just a silly legend," Sarah said, laughing. "But if you're scared, I can go alone." Emily wasn't convinced. She knew it wasn't wise to explore such places, especially at night. But Sarah's insistence and the curiosity that, despite everything, began to grow inside her led her to accept. After all, what was the worst that could happen? That night, the air was colder than usual, and the fog began to spread through the town, making it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. The two friends walked to the outskirts of Silent Creek, where the abandoned restroom was located. It was known to the town's older residents, a place that had once been a stop for travelers, but had long since been forgotten and left to decay. When they arrived, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Something was wrong with the place, a feeling of abandonment that seemed to seep into her bones. The doors were falling apart, and the broken windows allowed the fog to enter freely, creating an even more ghostly sight. "Shall we go in?" Sarah suggested, already pushing the door, which creaked loudly in the night silence. Emily hesitated but followed her friend. The inside of the restroom was even worse than the outside. The walls were covered in moss, and the damp, slippery floor made every step a challenge. The smell of mold and moisture was almost unbearable, but something else caught Emily's attention. A feeling of being watched, that they were not alone there. "This is strange," Sarah murmured as she explored the stalls one by one. Emily, on the other hand, stood still, feeling the air around her grow heavier, almost suffocating. She heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper that seemed to call her name. "Emily!" She turned sharply, but there was nothing, only Sarah, who was now focused on something on the floor. "What is this?" Sarah called, and Emily, trying to push aside her growing fear, approached. What they saw made Emily's heart race. On the floor were marks, as if someone had been dragged. The marks disappeared toward the back of the restroom, where a half-opened door seemed to beckon them to enter. "Should we go?" Sarah asked, her initial confidence beginning to waver. Emily looked at the door and felt the same chill as before. Something inside her screamed to get out of there, to run and not look back. but instead she took a step forward. "Let's see what it is," she replied, unable to take her eyes off the darkness beyond the door. They carefully pushed the door open, revealing a small compartment that seemed to have been used as a storage room. The smell there was even worse, a mix of rot and something else Emily couldn't identify. But what caught her attention the most was the dress. A wedding dress, old and tattered, hanging on a rusty nail on the wall. "My God," Sarah whispered, taking a step back. Is this real?" Emily didn't respond. She was paralyzed, staring at the dress as if it were the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. And then the whisper returned, louder and clearer this time. "Emily." She turned again. But before she could react, something cold touched her hand. A scream escaped her throat as she looked down and saw a female figure, pale with eyes glowing intensely in the darkness. The Spectral Bride. Chapter 2. The Abandoned Restroom. The cold touch of that hand made Emily's heart stop for a moment. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her feet were glued to the floor, as if an invisible force was holding her in place. Her eyes were locked onto the Spectral Bride's, who stared back with an empty gaze, yet filled with an ancient sadness and endless despair. That pale face, almost translucent, seemed more like a veil of death than of life. Sarah, who was beside Emily, couldn't fully see the figure, but she felt the weight of terror in the air. The presence of the Spectral Bride was suffocating, filling the small compartment with an aura of fear and death. Sarah grabbed Emily's arm, trying to pull her away, but Emily's body was rigid, immobile, as if she were in a trance. Emily, please, let's get out of here!" Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. She finally managed to shake Emily, and when Emily's eyes broke away from the bride's, a desperate scream echoed through the restroom. The two friends dashed for the exit, not daring to look back. The sound of hurried footsteps and labored breathing was the only noise that cut through the night's silence as they ran through the thick fog. The feeling of being chased was overwhelming, as if the Spectral Bride was right behind them, ready to drag them back to that cursed place. When they finally reached the main street, Emily collapsed to her knees, trying to catch her breath. Her thoughts were jumbled, but one thing was clear. She had seen something that wasn't of this world. Sarah was beside her, her face pale and her hands shaking uncontrollably. This can't be real," Sarah whispered, still in disbelief. "That thing, we saw it, didn't we?" Emily could only nod, still struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The stories that once seemed like mere rumors now had a terrible truth behind them. The Spectral Bride existed, and they had come face to face with her. However, this experience left them with more questions than answers. Who was that woman? Why did she haunt that abandoned restroom? And what happened to the women who disappeared? Emily knew she couldn't simply forget what had happened. The need to understand the mystery behind the Spectral Bride began to grow within her, but the fear was paralyzing. In the days that followed, Emily and Sarah tried to return to their normal lives, but the memory of the Spectral Bride wouldn't leave them alone. Emily, in particular, was tormented by nightmares in which she relived that moment repeatedly, each time with a more horrible ending. And there was something even more disturbing. She felt like she was being watched. Wherever she went, she had the feeling that the bride was nearby, waiting for the right moment to take her too. Sarah, on the other hand, tried to forget what had happened, convincing herself that it was just a collective hallucination caused by fear and the fog. But Emily knew it was real, and it wasn't long before others in town started talking about new disappearances. 2 weeks after that night, news spread through Silent Creek that a young woman had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Her body was found 3 days later on the banks of a river outside of town. And, just like the other victims, there was a piece of a wedding dress tied to her body, this time around her ankle. The town entered a state of silent panic. People avoided going out at night, and women in particular began taking extreme precautions. Some carried protective amulets, while others refused to walk alone under any circumstances. Emily couldn't shake the thought that the Spectral Bride was becoming more aggressive, more bold in her appearances. She knew she couldn't continue ignoring what she had seen. So she made a decision, She would go to the town's police station and tell Sheriff Richards everything she knew. Maybe he could help understand what was happening, and perhaps stop the Spectral Bride before anyone else disappeared. At the station, Emily found Sheriff Paul Richards, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious expression that suggested he had seen it all in his career. He received her with a mix of skepticism and curiosity when she mentioned the Spectral Bride. "Are you sure about what you saw, Miss Turner?" Richards asked, his voice deep. "This isn't the kind of thing I usually hear, and I can assure you I have plenty of work with more concrete cases." Emily felt a shiver as she remembered what she had seen. "I know what I saw, Sheriff. It wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination. Sarah and I saw that woman, the Spectral Bride, in the abandoned restroom, and I'm sure she's behind these disappearances." The sheriff was silent for a moment, studying Emily's face. "Very well, we'll investigate this further. But Emily, you need to understand that if we're dealing with something out of the ordinary, it won't be easy to find a solution." Emily agreed, knowing that, in a way, she had already accepted this truth. But the most important thing now was to do something to prevent more lives from being lost. Before leaving the station, the sheriff mentioned that a childhood friend of Emily, who had become a police officer in another city, was back in Silent Creek for a while. He suggested that it might be good to have someone close by to support her during the investigation. "Robert? Robert Taylor is back?" Emily asked, surprised. She hadn't seen Robert in years, since he had moved away to work in the police force of a larger city. He had always been like a brother to her, and knowing he was around brought a bit of relief. "Yes," the sheriff replied. "He's helping with the investigation. I'll ask him to get in touch with you." As she left the station, Emily felt that something was changing. Perhaps with Robert and the sheriff's help, they could finally unravel the mystery of the Spectral Bride and put an end to her reign of terror. But one thing was certain: the path ahead would be full of dangers, and Emily wasn't prepared for what was still to come. This was the first part of the story, covering chapters 1 and 2. Keep watching with chapters 3 and 4. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel Mysteries Beyond Midnight, and see you next time. Thank you for watching.